The entire auditorium went silent, not out of respect, but because they couldn't believe their eyes. A 17-year-old girl was standing at the center of the biggest engineering conference in America. Her hands covered in engine grease. Right in front of her stood a massive machine, one that had just been declared beyond repair. She didn't say much, just gave a quiet nod. And the engine began to hum, slowly but steady. Then suddenly, it roared to life, as if it had never broken down, as if it listened to her. The research room froze. Even the most seasoned engineers stepped back, because what they just witnessed wasn't just talent. It was the truth, a truth buried for 18 years, a truth that could shatter an entire corporation. And it all started with a joke, a careless remark from Richard Kane, CEO of Helix Motors, a man of power, arrogance, and now about to be brought down by a girl named Ford. Her name was Leona, the daughter of the janitor in that very building. That morning, the Texas Convention Center was packed. It was the launch event for the new generation AI engine, a revolutionary tech named X9, marketed as the pinnacle of American engineering. Military and media alike were watching closely, because if it worked, it could change how the world runs everything, from cars to airplanes. Even the city's power grid. CEO Richard stepped onto the stage, head held high, holding the mic like a politician. Engineers stood ready behind the screens. The engine itself was placed center stage, nearly 7 feet tall, polished like a weapon from the future. He raised his hand, signaled to activate it, but then nothing happened. No spark, no movement, not a single sound, just silence. Then whispers, then confused glances. He ordered diagnostics, but the engineers fumbled. No error found. He started losing patience, then turned to the audience. His eyes landed on a black man in janitor uniform. Marcus Ford. He had worked there over a decade. Always quiet, always punctual, always polite. Next to him stood his daughter Leona, a petite girl, tight curls, pulled back, wearing a faded canvas backpack. Richard gave a crooked smile. Why not let your daughter give it a try? The room burst into laughter, not the friendly kind, more like the kind bullies laugh when they don't expect a real answer. Leona looked up. Her eyes weren't angry, just calm. Marcus shook his head gently, tried to pull her back, but Leona stepped forward, one step at a time. No rush, no fear, just one thing in her eyes, understanding. She stopped in front of Richard, spoke softly. May I take a look? He raised an eyebrow. Be my guest. Some in the audience pulled out their phones, hoping to capture a moment of embarrassment. Leona slid off her backpack, unzipped it, pulled out a thick notebook tied with rubber bands, and a small box of circuitry. She climbed up the platform, opened the rear access panel. The lead engineer moved to intervene, but Richard waved him off. Leona inserted a new chip, checked a blown capacitor, quietly replaced it. Took her 4 minutes. No one understood what she was doing, but every motion was confident. There was no fear in those hands. She stepped back, looked the engineers in the eyes. Now try it again. The operator hit the switch, and this time, the engine roared, strong, steady, not a single hiccup. It wasn't just a fix, it was a challenge. Leona wiped her hands on her jacket, turned to face Richard, and said, I didn't fix your engine. I fixed my mother's blueprint. The entire room stood stunned. Her mother, what did she have to do with Helix Motors? A heavy silence fell, like the calm before a storm. But no one knew. The real storm hadn't even started. The air in the hall grew thick, like something invisible had just been ripped apart. Hundreds of eyes locked onto Leona, the girl who had just fixed America's most advanced engine, with bare hands and the memory of someone long gone. Richard stepped forward. His voice dropped. Who was your mother? Leona didn't answer right away. She pulled out her notebook, flipped to the first page. A weathered sheet was laminated inside. It was a blueprint. At the bottom was a handwritten name, Dr. Evelyn Ford, and a date November 1st, 2005. A voice broke out from the engineering crowd. This is the original drawing. No way. That name. She used to be a legend. Richard stepped back half a pace. His entire face froze, pale. His hand gripped the mic tighter. Leona looked him dead in the eye. My mom used to lead the research team here. Before they said she disappeared in a lab accident, but no body was found. No investigation, just one tiny article in the paper, and a gag order for the family. Marcus, Leona's father, stepped up. His hand trembled slightly, but his eyes were clear as ever. I signed that paper. I wanted to protect my daughter. I was scared, and I was threatened. The room fell into a deep hush. Leona placed the notebook on the control table. But today, I'm not afraid anymore. The crowd began to shift, from curiosity to suspicion, from suspicion to outrage. An older Helix engineer stepped forward. His name was David Boone. Gray hair, hunched back, tired eyes. I remember Evelyn. She wasn't like anyone else on the team. She didn't need formulas. She looked at machines and heard their heartbeat. We used to call her the machine whisperer. He paused. His voice cracked. And I stayed silent when she vanished, because I was scared to lose my job. I had kids, but now I can't stay quiet. He pulled out an old USB stick. This has the original design files and the real name of the inventor, not Richard Kane, not the engineering board, but Evelyn Ford. Richard grabbed the mic. This doesn't prove anything. There's no legal value here. This is a fabrication. Leona didn't flinch. She pulled out her phone, played a video. The footage was grainy, but the voice was clear. A woman stared into the camera, dark circles under her eyes, dim lighting. She spoke. If you're watching this, then I didn't survive. Helix Motors is stealing my work, and they're planning to erase me like deleted data. I don't want my daughter to grow up not knowing the truth. My name is Evelyn Ford. I will not be silent. Richard staggered. Phones started recording from every direction. The room exploded. A young engineer shouted, "They killed her." Another voice rang out. "They buried her genius and took the credit." A group of reporters were already live streaming. Leona's video began spreading across platforms. 30 minutes later, "Justice for Evelyn" started trending on Twitter. The U.S. engineering community was rocked. A brilliant female engineer who went missing was never honored, only robbed. Helix's entire tech floor was placed under lockdown. The National Patent Protection Board demanded an immediate investigation. Richard Kane was ordered not to leave the building. Leona and her father were escorted to the media room. Leona didn't cry. She sat quietly. In front of her was a screen flooded with emails from research labs, from engineering students, from other mothers. All of them said, "Thank you for standing up. Thank you for saying what we were too scared to." Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry for making you stay silent all those years." "It's okay, Dad. I understand. Silence used to be your shield to protect me, but now our voice is the real shield." That night, Leona's speech at the conference hit 10 million views. A documentary studio reached out for film rights. The president called for a full public investigation. Several Helix engineers publicly apologized, and Richard Kane indefinitely suspended. Just a week later, the FBI launched a formal criminal investigation. But the story didn't end there. A black car pulled up outside Marcus's apartment. An older woman stepped out, silver hair, long coat, eyes deep as a storm. She introduced herself. "My name is Charlotte. I'm Evelyn's mother. I'm your grandmother." Leona froze. She had only ever heard of this woman in scraps of old letters. The two embraced in the tiny apartment lobby. Tears fell quietly. I kept all of Evelyn's handwritten notes. I believed someone would carry on her dream one day, and I was right. Leona couldn't sleep. That night, it rained over Austin. Raindrops tapped against the window like a racing heartbeat. In her mind, her mother's voice echoed. The last words from the video, "If you're watching this, don't be afraid of the light. You were born to ignite it." She didn't know if she was strong enough, but she did know this. Silence was no longer an option. The next morning, headlines exploded across the country. Helix Motors scandal. Secret Buried for 18 years. 17-year-old girl shocks U.S. engineering world. Evelyn Ford. From forgotten genius to restored legend, reporters swarmed the Helix Motors headquarters, but Leona was nowhere to be seen. She was somewhere else, a small room, old and quiet. At the end of a hallway, in the National Archives, Leona stood beside Charlotte. In front of them, a gray document box, labeled by hand Evelyn Ford. The archivist gently unlocked it. No one's touched this file in 18 years, marked internal use only. Never released publicly. Charlotte held Leona's hand. This is what your mother left behind. Inside were hundreds of pages of notes, engine schematics, AI integration, calculations, papers stamped confidential in red ink, and one letter, never sent, addressed to Leona. Her mother's handwriting trembled. My darling, if I never got to say goodbye, remember, you are the continuation, not just of my dream, but of the justice I believed in. Leona cried. For the first time in this journey, she didn't try to be strong. Charlotte wrapped her arms around her. Cry, sweetheart, then we rise. That afternoon, Helix Motors issued an internal notice. All projects tied to X9 were suspended. The federal government announced a special investigative task force. Former Helix employees who once worked with Evelyn were summoned. David Boone, the veteran engineer, agreed to testify. New evidence surfaced from deep system backups, and through it all, the name Evelyn Ford rose like a tide. 1 week later, Leona was invited to speak at MIT. The auditorium overflowed with students and engineers. The host introduced her, the 17-year-old girl who dared to challenge an empire. Leona stepped up, wearing her mother's old hoodie. No makeup, no theatrics, just a calm voice. I used to think I was just the janitor's daughter, until I realized the truth doesn't need a title. We live in a system where the loudest voice gets to be right, but sometimes truth comes from the quietest person in the room. The entire hall rose to their feet, not for the technology, but for the spirit. That day, a historic decision was made. The U.S. government launched the Ford Initiative, a federal program supporting young tech talent from underrepresented communities, funding research, protecting intellectual property, empowering those who've never been heard, and the first person named honorary advisor, Leona Ford. Meanwhile, Richard Kane faced charges of falsifying records, abusing power, and covering up a workplace death. The investigation uncovered more than anyone expected. Not just Evelyn, but 4 other engineers, all gone without explanation, all silenced. The machine behind Helix ran on fear. Leona sat in a government boardroom. On the table, an invitation to speak at the United Nations. One official asked, "You're still young. Are you sure you want to keep going?" She looked out the window. The setting sun poured across the table. "I'm not sure of anything, but I know if my mom were here, she would have done this. So I'll do it." For her, that night, in a small community center near the neighborhood where her dad once worked, Leona held an old violin, her mother's violin. She played her first piece, not to impress, not to perform, but to say, "Mom, I've reached the place you were heading toward." 10 days after the video went viral, the world wasn't the same anymore. Not just because a machine came back to life, not just because a corporation got exposed, but because one girl made the entire system listen. On social media, Leona Ford, justice for Evelyn, truth can't be deleted. 3 hashtags showed up everywhere, in engineering classrooms, on the shirts of black and brown students, on handmade billboards in Chicago, Boston, Atlanta. Meanwhile, inside a government office in Washington, D.C., an emergency meeting was underway. Calvin Rohr, head of the National Ethics and Innovation Board, stood up. This isn't just one case of fraud. It's a broken model that's been abused for years. We need change, not just to investigate Helix Motors, but to clean up the entire industry. Someone asked, "So who will represent this new wave of justice?" Calvin answered, "That girl, Leona Ford." The next morning, Leona received an official letter from Congress inviting her to a public federal hearing. She would be the first minor under 18 to speak at a nationwide investigation on patent and corporate abuse. Marcus sat beside her as she read the letter. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" Leona nodded. "You stayed silent long enough. Now it's my turn to speak." The day of the hearing, it was broadcasted live across the country. She stepped up to the wooden podium. Behind her, an American flag. In front of her, hundreds of reporters, officials and citizens. A senator asked, "Aren't you scared?" Leona spoke calmly. "I was, but I'm more scared that one day my daughter might have to stay silent like my mother once did." She presented the evidence, how the patent system had been manipulated, how female and minority engineers were pushed out of research teams, how brilliance was erased before it had a chance to be seen. No one clapped, no one whispered, just the silence of people finally waking up. 1 week later, the Ford Reform Act passed its first stage. The bill required full transparency in patent registration, a ban on internal deletion of inventor names, free legal protection for inventors under 25. One commentator said on CNN, "That girl just did what 10 years of lawsuits couldn't." And Helix Motors. Richard Kane was officially charged. 3 former executives were arrested for destroying evidence. The company lost over 40% of its stock value in just 2 weeks. But more importantly, former employees began to speak up. Donna, an engineer, who once stood beside Leona at the conference, wrote a long post. "I was once ordered to remove Evelyn's name from a tech document. I stayed silent. Now I apologize." As for Leona, she didn't stay in the city. She took a week off school and went back to where it all began. The small housing block where a janitor once lived, where her mother first sketched out an engine design. She stepped into the old room. The desk still bore pen marks. The walls still had pictures of her mother taped up. Charlotte stood in the doorway. "Your mother once dreamed of building a research center here, so kids from the neighborhood could get their hands on real machines. That dream is yours now." 3 months later, a small ceremony was held. No cameras, no red carpet, just a few dozen people standing in a circle inside a repurposed warehouse. A wooden sign was hung above the entrance. "The Evelyn Ford Research Center for the Forgotten Generation." Kids ran around playing with engineering models Leona had brought back. Leona sat cross-legged on the floor, laughing and teaching. No one called her a genius. No one called her famous. They just called her Miss Leona. And for her, that was enough. That night, she sat on the porch steps, looking up at the starry Texas sky. Marcus sat beside her, coffee in hand. "I see your mother in you." Leona smiled. "I see her too. But this time, they don't get to take her voice away. I'll carry it for her." Leona woke up early. A soft breeze whispered through the wooden window frame. At the small research center, the kids had shown up before sunrise. They loved this place, not because of the machines, not because of the blueprints, but because here, no one laughed when you asked a stupid question. Leona stepped outside. A group of students was working on a hydraulic controller. A curly-haired girl looked up. "Miss Leona, why won't this turn?" Leona knelt down, smiled gently. "Because we flipped this axis the wrong way. But it's okay. Even the best engineers in the world have done that." The kids burst into laughter. So did she. But behind that smile was an entire generation that had just found a place where they belonged. That afternoon, a silver car pulled up to the center. A tall man stepped out, salt and pepper hair, wearing a government badge. He introduced himself as Ben Carter, Deputy Director of the National Office of Technology and Education. He held out a folder. "Leona, I'd like to talk to you about an idea." The idea was called Project Legacy, a national program to build centers like Leona's in every state, in every forgotten neighborhood, in every school without a lab. Ben said, "You don't have to do this alone. We want you to be the face of it." Leona looked at the proposal. The first page printed in bold, inspired by Evelyn and Leona Ford. She stayed quiet, then nodded, not for fame, not for credit, but because she knew if her mother were alive, she'd say yes. So now it was her turn. The news spread fast. From one small center, Leona Ford became a symbol of education reform. TV stations ran stories daily. Time magazine put her on the cover of a special issue. Headline in bold, "The girl who rewired the system." But not everyone supported her. Some corporations pushed back. Negative articles surfaced. They said Leona was overhyped, said she wasn't a real engineer. One headline even read, "From janitor's daughter to icon." Too much, too soon. Leona didn't clap back. She posted just one quiet line on her profile. "It's okay if they don't believe in me yet, as long as I don't stop believing in myself." That night, she sat in her small room, in front of an old photo of her mother. Charlotte poured her a cup of tea. "Are you tired, sweetheart?" Leona nodded softly. "Sometimes I want to disappear." Charlotte gave a warm smile. "But you chose to stay. You are the light. And sometimes the brightest light stands alone in the dark." The next morning, Leona visited the largest technical high school in New York. She stood before an auditorium of 2,000 students. She didn't speak about engines, didn't mention Helix. She said, "When I was little, I wanted to be an engineer, but no one ever told me that asking a dumb question was a privilege. Where I came from, dumb questions got you laughed at. So I went quiet, until the day I realized silence doesn't feed your dreams." The entire auditorium applauded, but Leona didn't stop there. Don't wait for the world to let you shine. Shine and let them adjust their vision. At that same moment, at the old Helix Motors headquarters, a new sign was raised, "Ford Campus, Institute of Ethical Technology." Former engineers Donna and David Boone were the first to join the faculty. The corporation officially acknowledged Evelyn Ford as co-creator of the X9 engine blueprint. Leona was invited to the opening ceremony. She didn't walk on stage. She stood below, looking up at the bronze plaque etched with her mother's name. Charlotte stood beside, her eyes brimming. "You did it, sweetheart." Leona shook her head. "It wasn't me. It was her." Through me. That night, Leona opened her notebook. The very last page. No engine sketches, no formulas, just one handwritten line. "If they won't say my mother's name right, then I'll build a world where they'll never forget it." The media storm had finally quieted down, but Leona kept going. Mornings teaching tech to kids, afternoons in meetings with the National Education Advisory Team, evenings back to her small room beside the center. No cameras, no spotlights, just her and unfinished blueprints. One night, her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Ms. Leona, my name is Jamal. I got suspended for fixing classroom equipment. I just wanted to help. No one believes me. Can you help me?" Leona stared at the screen for a moment, then typed, "Send me your design." 10 minutes later, a diagram popped up, a schematic for a robotic controller system. She looked closer. Her eyes widened, not because it was wrong, but because it was brilliant, more creative than what most college students submit. The next day, Leona showed up at Jamal's school, a public school in East Baltimore, a place gutted by years of education budget cuts. The tech lab had 4 outdated kits. Jamal sat in the corner, head down. His teacher said, "He doesn't follow directions. He doesn't stick to the curriculum." Leona asked quietly, "Does the curriculum follow him?" The room went silent. She sat beside Jamal, softly. "You taught yourself." Jamal nodded. "My dad passed away. Mom works all day. I watch videos online. I can't afford real parts, so I build with paper models." Leona opened her backpack, pulled out a parts kit, placed it in Jamal's hands. "I'll send you original blueprints and guides, but in return, you have to teach the others too." Jamal looked up. His eyes lit up like someone flipped a switch. "Yes, ma'am." 3 weeks later, a short video went viral. A 14-year-old boy explained gear systems to classmates. The caption read, "Student of Leona Ford, from Baltimore to Detroit, from Texas to the Bronx. Names once erased from textbooks were now glowing like small lanterns in the dark. Not flashy, not loud, but real and warm." An international education group invited Leona to Switzerland to speak at the Global Youth Technology Forum. The hall was lit bright, every seat filled. A Nobel Prize-winning scientist introduced her. "Now please, welcome to the stage. Not just an engineer, not just a storyteller, but a seed growing into a forest." Leona walked up. She didn't speak about herself. She spoke about her mother, Evelyn Ford, the woman erased from a world she helped build. She told Jamal's story, a boy punished for dreaming beyond the curriculum. She said, education should not be a locked door. It should be a field where anyone can plant something. The crowd erupted in applause. But Leona kept her voice humble. "I'm not the best. I'm just someone who was once told to stay quiet and chose not to." After the speech, a group of students from Sudan, Peru, and Syria found her. They said, "Your story made us feel less alone. People are erased everywhere. But if one person stands up, another will follow." Leona held their hands and said, "Then let's make sure the light never goes out again." Back in the US, she was invited to join a new initiative, the Quiet Network, a coalition of the overlooked. Women engineers, young inventors, skilled minds without formal degrees. They shared blueprints, traded tech, connected resources. No titles needed, just spirit. At the launch event, there was no big stage, just a whiteboard with one sentence: "Silence is no longer an option." Leona stepped up, placed her hand on the board. She didn't give a long speech. She just said, "We're not here to be heard. We're here so no one else gets forgotten." It was a cold winter morning. Leona sat alone in a small coffee shop in D.C. In her hands wasn't a blueprint, but a policy draft. The bold title read, "The Ford Act, Phase 2. She read slowly. One page talked about scholarships for students marginalized by academic bias. Another, a legal defense fund for young engineers whose ideas were stolen. One more, proposed integrating basic engineering into public high school curricula. She underlined each line, not like a politician, but like someone who once was the child no one believed in. Outside, snow began to fall. Inside, people started to recognize her. A middle-aged woman walked over. "My mother used to work at Helix. She never had the courage to speak up. But when you spoke, she cried. Thank you for speaking for those who couldn't." Leona held her hand. She's not silent anymore. Back at the government office, Leona entered a private meeting with 3 senators. On the table, her National Tech Education Reform Plan. One asked, "Are you sure high schoolers need to learn about AI?" Leona replied, "Not everyone needs to become an engineer, but everyone deserves the chance to understand how the world works. No one should be left behind just because of where they were born." Outside the meeting room, a news channel replayed Leona's earlier testimony. The headline read, "From Janitor's Daughter to National Advisor, Ford Keeps Moving Forward." Meanwhile, in Ohio, a group of 10th graders were building a robotic arm in a school garage. Their class rep, Eli, shouted. Miss Leona said, "You don't need a fancy lab, just faith and a few bolts." The whole class burst out laughing. In the corner, a teacher quietly wiped their eyes. Back in Austin, the Evelyn Ford Research Center had just received 100 new equipment kits, thanks to funding from the Ford Reform Act. Kids lined up to watch the robots move. A tiny brown-skinned girl asked, "Miss, can I really be an engineer?" Leona knelt down, touched her forehead gently. "It's not about can. You were born one." That evening, Leona sat on stage at the Smithsonian Institute. The panel, "When Silent Sparks Change." On stage were scientists, activists, and artists. And Leona. She was the youngest one there. When it was her turn, she shared, "When my mom died, no one told us. There was no funeral, just a contract that forced my father into silence. My mother's name wasn't spoken until I walked into that boardroom and fixed an engine." The audience stood in ovation. A professor quietly wiped his glasses. A student scribbled every word. Leona looked into the crowd. Her voice trembled. "Maybe my voice is small, but it carries far because it carries the truth." The next day, something unprecedented happened in the history of American engineering. A new body was formed, United States Council on Engineering Ethics and Attribution. Leona was named honorary chair, the youngest ever, no college degree, once called the Janitor Girl. A journalist asked her, "What do you say to those who claim you lack credentials?" Leona smiled. "I don't have a degree, but I had my mother's blueprint and an engine running again in under 3 minutes. Does that count?" On Twitter, engineers across the country began sharing their own stories with hashtags like "My first break," "Ford effect," "I was ignored too." America began to wake up, not because one girl spoke well, but because thousands once forced into silence were finally speaking. Marcus sat in the living room. CNN was airing footage of Leona at an international forum. He watched quietly. Charlotte walked in. She really is Evelyn's daughter. Marcus nodded, but the voice? That's all her. No mistaking it. Leona came home just before midnight. She opened her laptop, typed the first lines of her first memoir. "I used to think I was just a shadow. Then I realized light from within is enough to bring down a whole system if you refuse to shut it off." One spring morning, Leona stood before an empty field in the suburbs of Georgia. The grass reached her knees. A weathered wooden sign stood in the center. Hand-painted words read, "Where a dream will grow." She turned to the group of students behind her. They carried backpacks and blank notebooks. This will be the 10th Ford Center, not just a place to learn engineering, but to learn how not to let anyone steal your voice. The kids clapped. A tiny girl whispered, "This is the first time I've seen a leader not standing above us." Leona laughed. "That's because I prefer standing beside you." Back in Washington, D.C., a special session was underway in Congress. Topic: recognizing unconventional contributions to STEM education. One delegate said, "She doesn't have a PhD, no medals, but she has something no textbook teaches. Persistence in silence. The chamber applauded as Leona took the floor. She dressed simply, hair tied back, no slides, no script. She simply said, "As a child, I feared being misnamed because my mother's name was erased from every official record. Today, I stand not just with my name, but with the names of thousands who were forgotten." After her speech, a small statue was unveiled at the National Museum of Technology, not of Leona, but of Evelyn Ford holding a pen and a blueprint. The inscription read, "She wasn't remembered by applause, but by what kept living after she was gone." Leona stood in front of the statue for a long time. Charlotte stood beside her. Neither spoke, because sometimes silence says everything. That evening, Leona appeared on 60 Minutes. The host asked, "Do you think you've succeeded?" Leona smiled softly. "I think success is when you don't have to speak anymore, because a million others are speaking for you." She didn't do a talk show, didn't publish a book, didn't sign a brand deal. She returned to Texas, back to the first research center, where it all began. One day, a new boy arrived, quiet, hands greasy with oil. Didn't talk much, just sat alone building from old parts. Leona sat next to him, didn't ask his name, just handed him a slip of paper. It read, "You don't need to stand out to be worthy. Just don't shut down what makes you different." The boy took it. His eyes welled slightly, then kept building. Months later, a new program was announced. The Evelyn Grant, a scholarship for creative engineering students. No GPA requirement, just one condition. They were once underestimated, but never stopped doing what they loved. Leona signed the first award. At the launch event, a reporter asked, "What do you hope to leave behind?" She replied, "They don't have to remember my name. Just remember how it felt to finally hear theirs said right." That night, Leona played violin in the center's backyard, a piece her mother once wrote but never finished. Now, it played fully. No missed notes, no silence. The kids sat around her in stillness, not because they were sad, but because they were listening with their hearts. When she stopped, one child asked, "Miss Leona, what if I get forgotten one day?" She bent down, looked him in the eyes. "You won't, because the world is different now, and you are part of why." In the end, no grand stage, no blinding spotlight. Leona kept going, with small steps, but steady ones, because sometimes light doesn't need to echo. It only needs to shine just enough for someone else to find their way. Leona Ford's story is not just about a girl who fixed an engine. It's a symbol of what happens when someone dares to rise after being pushed aside. In today's America, many are undervalued, not because they lack talent, but because they didn't come from elite schools, don't hold fancy titles, or simply were never seen. Leona represents those who were once silenced. She doesn't have an engineering degree, but she has knowledge, passion, and most importantly, truth. The core lesson here is this: the loudest voice isn't always the one that's right. Sometimes silence echoes the deepest. When it comes from a place of justice and unshakable resolve. In real life, whether in the workplace, in education, or in the startup world, we need to rethink how we measure people. Not everyone who speaks softly is weak. Not everyone without accolades is irrelevant. Listen, trust those who've never been given the mic, because sometimes they're the ones who can repair a system that's long been broken. And if you've ever been misnamed, misunderstood, underestimated, remember, you don't have to stand out to make a difference. You just have to hold on to your integrity and refuse to quit. Because real light often comes from the places no one thinks to look.